Well, good morning to you. On behalf of the Detroit Historical Society, Detroit Public Television, I'd like to welcome you here this morning. My name is Christy McDonald. I am the anchor and moderator of My Week, which is Detroit Public Television's weekly news and political analysis show, and I also anchor special coverage for Detroit Public Television as well. So it is my delight to be here this morning and to welcome you here to our event this morning. And you know, now more than ever, and I think you'd all agree with me, that Detroit's story needs to be told. It's not an easy story, but we need to tell it where we've been, where we are now, and where we are going to go. So you're going to hear a lot this morning about partnerships that we're truly excited about and how those partnerships are going to help us tell Detroit's story and really bring Detroit's story to the rest of the world, which is so very, very important. And if this week has told us anything about Detroit's story and about Michigan's story, it's a complicated one. It's not an easy one to tell, and it's something that needs a lot of context. And we try to do that every week on My Week, and when we're doing in-depth stories on blight in Detroit, or we're doing in-depth stories about transportation, or we're doing one-on-one interviews with community leaders, or we're doing town halls on education, or we're doing people's stories, letting them tell their story in their own words, or we're going inside classrooms, seeing what's working, seeing what's not working, or we're doing stories on youth and getting them engaged, or then taking all of that material that we're doing and bringing it to the national level, to the PBS NewsHour. We're trying to find more ways to grow, to expand our coverage, and to make sure that Detroit's story gets told, and we can't do it by ourselves. We need amazing partnerships. We need other people to be able to get together and to bring this story to really a worldwide level, and that's what we are here to talk about this morning, about growing and expansion. We're going to have this press conference here this morning. Bob Burry is going to be here from the Detroit Historical Society along with Rich Homburg. They are going to be available to speak with you one-on-one afterwards, should you like to do that. And then following directly this news conference, we are going to have a panel discussion with the Detroit Journalism Cooperative as well as the Historical Society, and talking about these partnerships and talking about the stories and the initiatives that you're going to be seeing from us in this next year and how we tell Detroit's story. So without further ado this morning, I'd like to bring up Bob Burry. He is the CEO of the Detroit Historical Society. Bob, come on up.
Thank you, Christy, and good morning, everyone. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees, our staff, and our volunteers, welcome to the Detroit Historical Museum. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank our mutual board chairs, Tom Schaefer from Detroit Public TV and Tom Buell from the Detroit Historical Society, for taking time out of their day to be here as well, and all of you. I'm Bob Burry, Executive Director and CEO of the Detroit Historical Society. You know, for almost a century, we have had the privilege of telling Detroit stories and why they matter. Here at the museum, at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Belle Isle, and across our community. And like Detroit Public Television, we tell stories, usually without all these fancy cameras, but that's what we do every day. Stories of individual dreams and shared victories, stories of remarkable achievements and great challenges. It's our history, in our personal and collective stories that define who we are, can inspire where we're headed and inform where we're headed. Understanding the stories that make up our shared history has never been important and can unite us and make us stronger as we face the future and the challenges it presents. Today, it's really my pleasure to welcome Detroit Public Television and the One Detroit Initiative to join us as we work to tell Detroit stories and why they matter. We're especially pleased to be working on our Detroit 67 project that will look back at the people, places, and events of the past 100 years and look forward to what lies ahead in the next 50. Our partnership that Rich will officially announce in a moment is exciting on many fronts. First and foremost, it increases our awareness, expands our reach, and presents numerous opportunities to connect with more people outside of these four walls. And also, very importantly, we're pleased and excited to be joining forces with such a respected partner, an important community resource that, like us, cares deeply about Detroit's past, its present, as well as its future. So with that, I think we will move on with the announcement. And again, welcome to the Detroit Historical Museum. If you haven't been here for a while, take a look around. There's always something new on one of our floors. And now, again, thank you for being here. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rich Homburg, the President and CEO of Detroit Public Television.
Good morning. I find myself saying, I don't know, maybe you'll relate, that we live in the most important city in the United States. If you look at the 20th century, the importance of Detroit, an iconic city throughout the 20th century. If you look at the past 5 years, 15 years of where Detroit's come, again, the most important city. And if you think about the future of cities, so much of it is written here or needs to be understood here. This morning's news led with the first two stories in the top of the hour newscast were Flint and the DPS. Yesterday, the President of the United States was here to see the car show and visited Midtown. He was blocks from here. A few months ago, we talked to Mark Lance, who was the originator, one of the two people who wrote the Pure Michigan campaign of a few years ago. And I asked him to think about our positioning in Detroit. Mark's a very thoughtful guy. He's very deep. He tends to take a few days to think deeply about a topic, and then he comes back, often with a manifesto. And you'll see some of that in the campaign we're going to announce today. And Mark came back to me and he said, the word that kept coming to his mind was epic. That Detroit, if it was a novel, it would be a story, it would be 1,000 pages. It would be as big as War and Peace. He said, everything you need to understand about this country, you can learn a lot from Detroit. I tell that when we talk to PBS and we talk to other folks in DC, almost every program that comes up, and as they're touring a program or there's a new project or an initiative, I say, well, you'll be coming to Detroit, right? Because it's the most important city in the United States. And I think they know that. And there's a certain game to this town that says, you have to understand us to be part of us, and we have to understand how we're going to exchange value and how we're going to understand each other. But if you look at music, if you look at culture, if you look at tough school systems, if you look at inner city challenges, if you look at infrastructure and where that's going, almost every topic affecting big cities, Detroit plays a unique role. Not always positive, not always perfect, but always unique and always important and always demanding to be understood. That's the city we live in. And so today we're announcing a couple of pretty simple things, but they're very important, and they're another important step for this station. We're going to open a bureau inside of the Detroit Historical Museum and work for the next couple of years to carve a path around telling the Detroit story yesterday, today, and tomorrow in greater detail, more nimbly, and in conversation and exchange with the community. Not a documentary, not a single program, but an initiative and a mindset that says we've got to understand lots of things and lots of people, and we have to turn that into an ongoing dialogue. The opportunities today in media are enormous. We've got a big television station. We have radio partners you'll hear more about from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. But the ability to magnificently tell those stories on every platform, you see it all before you, every opportunity, we think we can head in the direction of doing that. There's lots of hard work to be done. A little bit about where we've been the past couple of years. We've been building for quite a while at Detroit Public Television. Over 10 years ago, we started WRCJ and brought classical music back to the city. The station continues to do well in partnership with the Detroit Public Schools, the station's owner. We approached Christy and Stephen and Nolan and said, what if we brought the two editorial page editors together and then the lion tamer, Christy McDonald, and form My Week? And that show continues to build initiative. I think they make each other better. I think Nolan and Stephen, every week there's some sense they're learning from each other too. And Christy's sort of facilitating terrifically. We built a project called the Detroit Performs. It started as a website to celebrate arts and culture, became a weekly television show, and in the fall became a primetime special. We'll do that again this fall. With American Black Journal, we asked the Pulitzer Prize-winning Stephen Henderson to step up and host the show. It's also produced, as is My Week, by Daphne Hughes, a veteran Detroit producer. It's a terrific team that I think grows in importance every day. Beyond that, we built partnerships with organizations like Sphinx, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. More people have seen a symphony online via our partnership than any symphony in the world. The Detroit Symphony Orchestra said they wanted to be the most accessible. We're helping them to be the most accessible. This spring we'll go back to Mackinac for our 6th year of coverage of the Mackinac Conference. A typical opportunity where something's important, and if we understand it well enough, we can help amplify it, and we very successfully, I think, have done that. We have a community affairs panel that advises us on what we need to understand in that community. That was a handful of people, say 10 years ago, and Adele Anderson and Terry Gallagher have now turned it into 40 people or so who help us understand the city. These are real folks on the line doing things, and we meet with them on a regular basis and say, tell us what we need to know about education, tell us what we need to know about parenting. We built partnerships in 100 different directions. Why? Because we're a television station. We're an Air Force to the armies of people doing things for the city. And it's very important that we understand that partnership, and we try to work hard for it every day. So where are we today? Strong audiences. In the face of media disintegration, our audiences are stronger today than they were 10 years ago. Our rankings among national stations continue to grow. We have 70,000 members who each year write a check personally to support the station. That's important. And at the same time, we've become the most diverse public television station in the country. Among measured markets, if you look at the Arbitron numbers, Detroit Public Television has the most diverse audience of any station in the country. And I think it's not just the past few years, it's the legacy of a show called American Black Journal, Detroit Black Journal, and I think some great outreach over the years. So what's next? We spent a long time thinking about our strategic plan and listening to the community and hit upon two really important issues. One is preschool, and you may have heard it recently, we made an announcement with Michigan State. And the other is Detroit outward. We redefined our geography a couple of years ago around, we've all had this thing, what's your Detroit? Is it Detroit or Detroit or Detroit? We decided that our geography was Detroit outward. And we need to look at everything we do through the lens of Detroit outward. Start your day as Detroiters. And starting today, we start our day in Detroit. Start your day as Detroiters and move outward. And we continue to build upon that. We also found that there was a real need to turn what we do not just into shows, but into a dialogue, into an exchange, into a multi-platform, into an everyday experience, and we're working hard to do that. With all that in hand, there's a couple partnerships that we think were very important. For a couple years now, we've been working with WUOM, WDET, New Michigan Media, and the Center for Michigan on what we call the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. It's a thriving exchange of information, started around the bankruptcy with some funding for the Knight Foundation, the Ford Foundation, recently bolstered with some additional funding, and it's become a journalism cooperative that's important. And as we looked at a venue and a place to really start to build further, we approached Bob. Bob actually invited us into their 67 initiative, and we came to see him. Our biggest concern was, we think it's a lot more than 67. We shook hands and he said, it's a lot more than 67. And we've talked a lot about, it's really understanding the 20th century and then putting 67 into perspective. That's important. So we start with an understanding of everything that led to that, and then everything that's come back. We also talked a lot about understanding the past 15 years, the past decade, and Bob and I have gone back and forth. We talked earlier in the week, and he said, we think now it's 150 years. He said very sincerely, we were talking about sort of aligning of the discussion. He said, really, we think it's 1917 to 2017, and then we need to look at 2067. I was worried that they might have not a broad enough scope. I think, Bob, you have a broad enough scope. So there's a couple of things that are important for you to know about this. The key is shared assets. There are things the museum needs, there are things this television station needs. If we create them together, we promise not to start a museum. They promise not to start a television show, so let's really work together about shared assets. The second is, this is an expansion of what we do. It's another important step along the road for Detroit Public Television. It's ongoing, it's a commitment, and it is another, as important a step as we'll take, but it's another important step. We think we can keep walking down that line. We're expanding and challenging ourselves in important ways. If you talk to the employees, they'll tell you almost every job at Detroit Public Television has changed the last couple of years as we've adapted to a media world that needs to be fed in a whole different way than it was, say, 10 years ago. A couple of thanks, and then I want to show you the campaign. Thanks to Bill Smith, who heads our Smith Leadership Group, and to Bill and Shirley Fox, who support our public affairs. They're our lead gift individuals around our leadership and public affairs category. Thanks to them. Thanks to all the funders. Thanks to our board. Adele, thanks to the CAP. You'll see some CAP members. The people in the video are people who influence the video, and that's the fun part. And I think we could probably give you a bit of a story on every single person you'll see there. So thanks to everyone who supported it. Bob, we're really excited about doing this. This room is terrific, and so we're going to spend a lot of time here. And without further ado, This was the campaign is produced by Ed Moore with scripting and the brand positioning from a guy named Mark Lance at an agency here, Factory, a terrific agency, real smart guy. And I think you'll like it. It's a start, and I think we can play the video.
Every day,
the sun rises on Detroit.
And 4 million women,
men,
and children
go through the familiar routine
of their lives.
The road less traveled on is where you find what you're looking for.
Working,
learning,
laughing,
Fighting.
crying.
I wanna feel your heart beating. I want you more than a memory.
Every day, lives begin and end.
Families are made and broken.
fortunes large and small,
are built and lost.
every day.
The story of this place
Is one day greater. One
Day.
greater.
Join Detroit Public Television in 2016
as we tell the story of Detroit.
in a way it's never been told before.
In the words of those who call it home.
Follow your heart, there you'll find a home. Look past the stars, you'll never be alone.
It's your story.
Our story.
the story of a city.
The city.
My city.
Our city.
Is where you find what you're looking for.
It's one Detroit.
one.
Detroit.
And it's only on Detroit Public TV.
So Bob and I are available for questions, and
Okay. Okay. No questions.
no questions.
Sure.
My name is Sandy McMillan. I'm a trustee and former president of the museum. But Bob, tell us how we're progressing with the project 1967. Are you in a position to give us some updates?
Sure. You know what? The question was about our project called Detroit 67, looking back to move forward, which is a major initiative of the Detroit Historical Society that we're looking to collaborate much of that work with the efforts of Detroit Public TV. Here's our plan: is we recognize that it's more than a story; it's a journey. It's a major defining event for what happened in 1967 across Detroit and the region. And 2017 offers us an opportunity to really look back and understand the factors that led up to it, what's happened since, our successes, perhaps our shortcomings, and how we might do things differently going forward. So it's evolved into a very comprehensive project where we've engaged many members of the community, some of our core partners, including Detroit Public Television and the Charles Wright Museum and New Detroit, and many, many other organizations that have stepped up and said, yeah, we want to be part of that story. So we've created a lot of partnerships, and there'll be a series of programs and outreach across the community. The second major part of that is the opening of an exhibition here that will take place in the second quarter of 2017. And that will be an exhibition that I think that the team that's here from the Detroit Historical Society will agree will be really groundbreaking, and we expect that to have national significance and to really create a model, create a series of lessons for, as Rich said earlier in his comments, for America. Because what's happening in America is really encapsulated in Detroit, and in many ways we represent all of it: the good, the bad, the successes, the challenges. So the exhibition will open in 2017. And in addition to that, there'll be a wide variety of additional programs with partners, as well as some opportunities to act. What's going to be different because we took the time collectively to commemorate what happened in 1967. How is the community going to be different? What are some of the things that we'll put in place? And we have a variety of other actions across the community, well beyond the four walls, that will make an impact, and we hope help define the next 50 years. So kind of a long-winded answer, but things are on track. Many partners in the room. I see Detroit Jewish News, and I know our friends from the news and the Free Press and other folks that have signed up and said, we want to be part of that, in addition to channel Detroit Public TV.
Other questions? No, we're going to do some one-on-ones. Go ahead.
How would a person become a CAP member, and can you explain what the CAP is?
The Community Advice Panel is, we have a board of directors, and they're great leaders in the community, but how do we really understand issues? There's a Corporation Public Broadcasting requirement that you have a community advisory panel. The trick is to really use it and engage them. And so Deli Anderson, and I think with some help from Terry Gallagher and other members of the CAP, have built our CAP. And as you know, it's community members that want to drive certain understanding of certain issues, advocates for issues. And so in our strategy, it's really around 5 issues. It's children education, arts and culture, leadership and public affairs, energy, environment, and health. And so we ask members of the community, help us understand what's important. And these are very robust conversations, sometimes pretty dramatic, around needs, around what's important, around understanding those, and they influence how we shape programming. And so it gives us an ongoing dialogue with people around what's important.
My question is for Rich. You had mentioned in your remarks that you were opening the Detroit Bureau here at the Detroit Historical Museum. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means and what that'll entail?
Sure. We're a staff of about 70, and the feeling was, how do we get into place to be able to produce and collect content on a more everyday basis, and having a base for that. If you look at the Historical Museum, highly trusted organization, great facility, great backdrop, great partners. And so when we approached Bob, the idea wasn't, let's form a marketing partnership, or let's form, initially, your organization had approached us to say, would you like to get involved? And I said, get involved, we want to move in. And so the idea is, to me, I'm big on face-to-face. Everything starts with once you get face-to-face, and the ability for Ed Moore and his team to be able to say to someone, come by the Historical Museum today, we'll shoot that interview, and to be prepared to do that. And this magnificent backdrop for that was really perfect. And so we really wanted to test Bob, because he wanted us to come in and be, support a little, and we're like, you got space? And so upstairs we have 1,100 square feet to fill and keep active.
Well, and I might add to that is in addition to knowing, of course, Detroit Public TV, they've been very involved with us, and Michael and the team that have helped us really started some of the early stages of our 67 project. And it goes back to actually Mackinac Policy Conference last year, and since we've worked together to get some really incredible videoed oral histories that will, and the beauty of this kind of partnership is, whereas we can use those for our exhibition potentially, they can use those as well. And rather than being duplicative in the effort, you've got that incredible, important historical resource, and you've got an agreement to share that in a mutually beneficial way. Mutually beneficial meaning it helps tell a story and helps advance both, the agenda or not the agenda, but the perspective and the hope and the vision for the future that we all want.
Other questions? I know we're going to be available for one-on-ones following this. If there are no more questions, what I want to do is move into the panel discussion with Marlo Stoudemire from the Historical Museum and our group from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. They're going to come on stage. We're going to play the video, make a quick transition to them, and they'll give you a sense of sort of the journalist's perspective and the historian's perspective on where this initiative is going to go. So without that, we'll hit the video and bring folks on stage.
Every day,
The sun rises on Detroit.
And 4 million women
Men
And children
go through the familiar routine
of their lives.
The road less traveled on is where you find what you're looking for.
Working,
learning,
laughing,
Fighting,
crying,
I wanna feel your heart beating. I want you more than a memory.
Every day, lives begin and end.
Families are made and broken.
fortunes large and small
are built and lost.
every day.
The story of this place
Is one day greater.
One
day
Greater.
Join Detroit Public Television in 2016
as we tell the story of Detroit.
in a way it's never been told before.
in the words of those who call it home.
Follow your heart, there you'll find a home. Look past the stars, you'll never be alone.
It's your story.
Our story.
the story of a city.
The city.
My city.
Our city.
Is where you find what you're looking for.
It's one Detroit.
one.
Detroit.
And it's only on Detroit Public TV.
All right, I can't say enough about that amazing video presentation that Ed Moore and his team worked on. If we could just give him a round of applause, because that to me, it was really an amazing thing that they did, and I really think it gives you the sense and the spirit of what we're going for. And I think it's very interesting. We've heard a lot this morning about partnerships and growth and expansion and telling the story. And you might all be thinking, what does that all really mean? What can we all really expect from this? And so that's why we've assembled this great panel of people who I know them all very well, from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and of course from the Detroit Historical Society. And we're going to give you a sense now of how this is all going to work, how we've all started to work together. For those of you who are not familiar with the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, we're going to explain that a little bit as well. And so we're just going to kind of get into a little discussion here. And if we have a little time at the end, if you have any questions out here, you can direct to the panel, and we'll do that for you as well. But I want to introduce and start all the way here on my right, Michelle Serbinovich. She's the radio general manager for WDET here in Detroit's public radio. Lester Graham from Michigan Radio is also here. David Zeman, he is the editor of Bridge Magazine, is here. And on my left is Hai Goshagan. He's the director of New Michigan Media. Ed Moore is from Detroit Public Television, and Marlo Stoudemire is from the Detroit Historical Society here. So, and he is the one who is heading up the Detroit 1967 project. And so we will get into all of that. But first off, let me, I guess, and I'll let the panel help me explain what the work of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative has been doing. It is this consortium, this group of public media, and we've really joined our resources together to what we say, tell Detroit's story. And David, I'm going to start with you and have you explain a little bit.
Sure, we've been working together for a couple years now, and it's really unique in this environment, one of the most unique partnerships in the nation to have public radio stations, public TV stations, New Michigan Media, Bridge Magazine, all of us working together to tell the story of Detroit's emergence from bankruptcy and its future afterward.
And Hai, not a lot of people might know what New Michigan Media is, and how would you explain all of the various papers and representations that your company has?
Yes, New Michigan Media is really the only collaboration of its kind in the nation, where the largest ethnic and minority papers have come together to create a real working partnership. The New Michigan Media includes the largest of its kind, the largest Jewish paper, the Jewish News, the Arab American News, the Latino Press, the Michigan Chronicle, which is the African American paper in town, and the Michigan Korean Weekly. The circulation is well over 100,000, and so the papers represent the community in this region, and the collaboration has been in sharing resources and working on stories together in breaking down the barriers that come up between minority communities, so we get to know one another better in the region, as well as having a louder voice in what happens in the region. And finally, and the collaboration is real, but there's also an important symbolic part of it too, that is in a region fractured very often on race. Here is a real working together of the main communities in the metro area. That's New Michigan Media.
All right, and Lester, let me ask you, and just in terms of, give us an example of some of the things that you've been able to partner up with, like on a day in, day out basis, and some stories that you've been able to do because of Detroit Journalism Cooperative.
It's been unique because we've always worked with our public radio partners, but working with Bridge Magazine more, working with DPTV, working with the folks at New Michigan Media has given me a lot of opportunity to talk to and work with other journalists. We've been working on the bankruptcy, of course. We've been looking at the year after bankruptcy for Detroit. This coming year, we're looking at doing something completely different, and that is looking at who's being left behind in Detroit. You know, we hear a lot about the comeback in the Central Corridor, the Central Business Corridor, but there are a lot of people in the neighborhoods who aren't experiencing or not sharing in that prosperity. That's what we want to look at, and we're going to start by doing what led to the events that occurred in 1967. How many of those grievances that were outlined in the Kerner Commission report, which was a commission put together by Lyndon Baines Johnson while he was president, what grievances were there, what grievances are still remaining, and what could have been done or should have been done to make sure that we aren't in the shape we are today in Detroit and many other urban centers.
And I do want to get into more of the specifics there, Lester, and in terms of what it's like in an editorial meeting with all of you sitting and deciding, you know, how do we attack a subject from here, and how do you decide what you end up covering?
Everybody gets along except for David and me. My partner in this, Bill McGraw, has been wonderful. It's been great.
It's actually interesting to be in a room. But Michelle, I want to ask you, and kind of give us the perspective of being able to share stories from all of the different outlets, you know, across platforms.
So it's interesting because in media right now, we have radio, we have television, and then we have the digital and mobile, and we're getting news on our phones, and even beyond those mediums, even partnering here with the Detroit Historical Museum of bringing those stories to life in a physical place, in a different way that people can interact with them is really exciting. And with this team, when you have somebody who's traditionally working in a visual medium, working with somebody whose real strength is audio and how do you hear a story, and somebody who is active in the community and actually knows what's on the minds of residents, and those people sit in a room, you're going to get a very different story, and you're going to have a very different experience of hearing and listening to and seeing that story in the end. And I think the most exciting thing about this is that we also get to bring the public in. Whether that's telling people stories here, whether that's bringing people in for those kinds of conversations that Rich was talking about that DPTV holds, but also we've done workshops in the last year. We're going to do more with young people and presenting these stories to young people. Here's what's actually going on in your city. What is your story? Now let's include that in our coverage. So I think bringing the public in and taking some of this work out to the public in a new way is really unique.
And I think what's interesting, what Michelle was saying about the different components that we have, because you're talking about print, you're talking about radio, and at Detroit Public Television, we're the only real video component here. So Ed, let me go over to you. What is that in terms of being able to say, okay, now we can take a clearinghouse of a lot of this information and make sure it comes to life and you see people telling their stories?
Well, I think it's another way really to reach another audience, to help grab eyeballs that maybe some of this information passes them by. I think one of the great things about our cooperative is that we're one of the first cooperatives that have been put together by a CPB that have been blessed by this CPB with a great
And explain
grant.
CPB real quick for people
Corporation
who
for
don't know.
Public Broadcasting. They've helped seed a lot of these cooperatives across the country, but we're one of the first that actually include video. And I think that's a real testament to how important the Detroit story is. It's not about what we do at DPTV, but just I think how they feel Detroit is a story that really it's such a deeper, richer story that could connect to cities across the country, really.
You know, and we can't, and I said it earlier, you know, we can't do it alone. In our audience by itself, but then when we start partnering up with WDET's audience, who maybe haven't sampled Detroit Public Television before, or maybe haven't read Bridge Magazine before, or maybe haven't gone on to Michigan Radio before, or New Michigan Media, and all of a sudden you're expanding the reach. And that's really what the focus is here, is making sure these stories get out and they go beyond. And so now let us take now to this next project step. And Marlo, let me go over to you. Talk a little bit about how you see the Detroit 1967 project from your perspective here at the Detroit Historical Society, and how we start to try and tell that story, and what are the important elements of it?
Thank you for having me, first of all, and thanks for being up here with everyone else. Well, before I start with the story, I want to start with the fact that Detroit is people. People are most important in everything that matters in this country. It's more important than a dollar. It's more important than status. It's more important than a zip code. And if you start at the core of the people and you give it back to the people, that's the most important thing. The people own the story. And so having a journalism cooperative to be able to create those outlets or those portals of engagement to give people a platform to be heard, give people a way to listen, give people a chance to participate, and not only that, give them a chance to see, no matter how small or big, their actions matter in the future of the city. That's where you start first. The 67 project is not an exhibit. It's a community engagement project. It's a multi-year project of diverse voices, programs, and exhibitions that gives us a chance to understand where we've been, gives us a chance to understand where we are now, but more than anything, we need to identify the work that still needs to be done. So controlling the narrative is important in Detroit. We have to own it here first. We have to set the stage, set the tone, and more than anything, allow us to kind of get comfortable, to rebuild trust. Then we have to transition to, how does this relate to the rest of the region? How are the dots connected? How are things that are going on in Detroit parallel to someone else who may not necessarily identify from a historical perspective or ethnic background or cultural background? How does this relate to the rest of the country, and how does it relate to the rest of the world? Because this is the destination for leaderships and lessons learned on how to rebuild in contrast of everything that was destroyed in '67. That's the baseline. We have to make sure that we give it back to the people. So at the Historical Society, our job is to take it outside of the walls of the museum, capture the history, make sure there's programming in place so we can learn, have some education components, do the world-class exhibit, knock it out the park, and then put out a call to action. What are you doing to help Detroit move forward?
I think it's interesting, David, when we have conversations about how we cover this, is there something that you need to keep in mind, that you don't just look back at the history of the civil unrest in the summer of '67 and stay there? What is the danger of that, or what is the danger and some of the pitfalls that you're looking at and going forward with coverage?
Well, you know, one of the things that we wanted to do is to take a look at it, look at some of the conditions that were present in '67, as you know, as Lester alluded to, but really just to use that as a springboard for looking forward. You know, to what extent have the people of Detroit made advances or not made advances in the times since? What were the conditions then as opposed to now? And you're absolutely right. It's going to be told through the people, and it's not going to be just, you know, looking at historic clips and so forth. It's going to be about you know, really examining where the neighborhoods are now, whether we're talking about political power, civic power, or police, community relations, you know, jobs, housing patterns, discrimination. We're going to be looking at all of that and bringing it forward to see how the city and the region can advance.
Yeah, Hi, go ahead and jump in.
To add to that, I mean, as New Michigan Media's audience gets added to the investigation and coverage, we'll be able to see how minority issues have shifted, maybe from an African American focus, you know, during Kerner, to other minority populations today. I mean, Detroit is 8 to 10% Latino, for example, and are the problems that are mentioned in Kerner, whether it's housing or whether it's police brutality, have they moved on now, for example, to include other minority and ethnic groups as well? The Arab American community in Dearborn, that also is in Detroit, faces some of these very similar things that are mentioned in Kerner from 50 years ago. And that will expand as well, our understanding of what happened and our understanding of how things are today.
What are some of the parallels, Lester? I know that you've really looked into the reports as you're setting up kind of what the editorial calendar is going to be for this next year.
Well, Bridge has done some nice research, data mining to find out what life was then and what it is now. And we're finding that on a number of measures that life for black residents in Detroit is worse than it was in 1967 prior to the uprising. So we're trying to figure out what's gone on there, why does that happen, how can we put some solid numbers on it, and then where are the stories? Who are the people who have lived that time and where are they headed now? We're working on that. We've been reaching out. We've been looking at, what does power mean? Because one of the things, a lot of people say, well, when Coleman Young became the mayor of Detroit, why the African Americans had all the political power they needed. Well, political power doesn't mean much if you don't have economic power, and we know where the economic power lies. It's not with the politicians. So we're looking at a lot of those things, how they work together and what that means for today and where we can find solutions. And that's the toughest part. I mean, we're journalists, we like to point out problems. It's a lot harder to find solutions, but we're finding those people.
But that's what you were talking about, Marlo, that it's very important to not get stuck right in this one place and say, well, that happened, and this is still happening, so what do we do now? What's the importance of going forward?
Yes, well, just to clarify, this is not an opportunity to finger point. This is an opportunity to identify what work still needs to be done. It's important to have that historical context, right? It's important for us to not necessarily start at 67, because it didn't start at 67, right? You're talking about going back 50 years and maybe even before that to set the tone for what happened, right? What happened after 67? I tell people all the time, people forget, I was the generation that was born after that, right? I was born in 1976. I grew up in the 80s where my neighborhood was devastated by crack cocaine and the effects of that, and the things and the stories and the impact that it's had on not just me, but different generations, right? Those things matter, but more than anything, what are we doing today in 2017? There's a lot of people that are moving the needle. You have the Tanya Allens of the world. You have the Horatio Williams and the Quincy Jones, who are ground floor neighborhood-based people. But then you have others who are in other positions of influence. The key is, what's the common thread that's going to help us move forward, right? There's a lot of things that I feel that are not fair. There are a lot of things that are not right. But what are we doing to fix them? I grew up in a time where it was really hard. And there were a lot of things that were unfair, but we still had to survive. I know what it's like to eat cereal with water and not milk. And so my point is that we have to get tough. We have to get strong. We have to protect each other, but we can't glaze over the fact that the realities for everybody today are not the same. And you can't just glaze over that. You can't just say, well, why can't you just get it done? History matters, right? But what we do with the history and how we learn from it, and it's a shared collective history that's going to propel us through 2067. We're talking about building solutions and creating things for a lifetime of people where we may not be there. How are we engaging the youth? How are we engaging those voices who have felt marginalized? Sometimes listening is the most important thing, and giving people their place. That's important.
And then, so Ed, when you sit in a meeting and say, gosh, how are we going to be able to articulate that? How are we going to be able to tell those things across all these platforms? What do you come up with?
Well, that's why it's so important to have all of us working together in so many different media. I think Marlo brought up, he said one word that I connect with more than anything, and it's all about context. These stories have to give context, and I think if you look at our group and you ask the question, well, how are you different from any of the other media that's coming back down to Detroit or that is covering Detroit in this new way? It's like I have to say, we're looking at these problems from many different perspectives, many different angles. I think we're going to give a depth of context and nuance and complexity that I just don't think other media sources are ready to give. And that's why it's so exciting to be sitting up here with all these people. I mean, you hear them talking and they all have a different perspective and are coming at it from a slightly different angle, but hopefully that's going to give us a real 3D picture of what's going on in the city.
Can I say one last thing? Mm-hmm. Detroit is a classroom for the rest of the world. We have to invite people in to learn, and we have to lead. That's one of the outcomes that I hope that can happen from this, is that people see not only the historical museum, but the city as a destination to come and learn on what to do and what not to do, on how to rebuild. So that's important too, and that's why engaging the entire community and giving everyone a chance to be a part of this is important. A story this big takes all of us.
Michelle, give us some perspective from DETs.
So to Marlo's point, I think when we talk about solutions too, if we're having a conversation, if this work and the way we're approaching it is generating conversations between people who would normally not talk, people who might not have the same context, that's going to be important because we're not going to develop better solutions if we don't have more people at the table that we're typically not at the table. And I think for the point you made, Marlo, about the rest of the world is watching, and that's, I think, the beauty of us putting this online, where people who are not here, who might not get WDET's signal, who might not turn to DPTV to learn about Detroit, are going to be able to hear these stories of Detroiters, to hear what we're grappling with, and to be able to bring other stories in as well. What are other cities doing? Where have other cities succeeded where maybe we're struggling, and vice versa? We look at what's happening globally. We look at what's happening with Europe. You know, multiculturalism. How was that working? You know, we're going to be able to bring in all of these perspectives into our work and make sure that we're telling a more robust story that has been told.
And we're talking about the world watching Detroit as well. So let me end up by asking you probably all the same question. Haig, I'm going to start with you. How do you think Detroit is perceived now with the rest of the world, and how can we tell our story?
I mean, in many ways, Detroit is what can happen to a lot of different places, or has happened to a lot of different places as well. And I think how we engage with the issues that got us to this point, how we harness the resources that are available to us across the variety of communities that have the potential to help in the revitalization of the city, including in particular the minority communities and the ethnic populations, which are often excluded in many ways from the participation in change. I think the way we handle it will say a lot about both us and what is possible to do in the United States in this day and age.
David?
I really think that the story of Detroit has been a very exciting one to people nationally and internationally. Detroit is drawing a lot of interest and a lot of buzz, but it's mainly about the kinds of things that are happening in this, central downtown area. And I think we all agree that, and I'm sure the city's leadership agrees as well, that until things start changing in the neighborhoods for average people, people who've been here for generations, then Detroit can't be declared a success.
Lester, what do you think?
You ask about perceptions outside of Detroit. Nationally and internationally, I think there are a lot of myths that need to be torn apart, torn down, and a more revelation. But it's not just nationally and internationally. You can go to the suburbs and you can go to mid-Michigan and you're going to see the same kinds of myths and misperceptions. And I think if we can shine a little bit of truth on what's going on in Detroit right now and how it got there, we might be able to clear up some things for people.
Michelle, what do you think?
I was going to say that self-awareness for us as a region, as a state, I think is going to be really important, especially as we have generations who have heard of what happened but didn't live it. You go look at actual stories of what happened then, and all of a sudden you're having a different conversation. So if we're not able to have that conversation here in our city, if we're not able to have that conversation in our state, then what are we sharing with the rest of the world if we're not really having the conversation at home? So I think that's going to be exciting as we're able to have this dialogue, what that ends up doing for us, and then how do other cities and other places start having those same types of conversations.
Ed?
I joined Detroit Public Television about 6.5 years ago, and when I first joined, we used to get a lot of calls from documentarians from France and from Denmark wanting to come to Detroit and be led around to be shown the crumbling buildings and film it as if it was an archaeological exhibit, implying that the city had died. But I find that is very much changing. The hunger is more about what are you doing to redirect things? How is Detroit coming back? So I think the whole narrative is very different. I think we have a real opportunity to get a hold of that narrative, as Marlo was saying, control it for ourselves, and also to educate other cities throughout the country and internationally as well.
Marla, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
I agree with everything that they said. I think from my time traveling around the world, growing up at 6 Mile and Gratiot in Detroit, being executive boardrooms and in barbershops, I think what people want to know is what are we going to do to rebuild the trust? What are we going to do to lock arms and do it together? A lot of people think the city's segregated. A lot of people think that Detroit is like a third world country, but then there are other people that I've met that says, we love Detroit. We think you guys are really doing good, and you guys should start thinking better of yourself. You guys should start celebrating. You guys should start really putting it out there, but don't leave anybody behind. And it all depends. We need to own it, and that's what people are telling us. And then they say, own it and then invite us in. We have to roll out the red carpet and let people know that when you come in, it's not going to all be pretty. There's going to be some issues. Come help us. Come work with us. We got to invite people to work with us. Sometimes it's not necessarily money. Sometimes it's effort. Sometimes it's getting to know each other. It's the collaboration. People want to see what's different. Let's create a new model. People want to see what that model is. If you Google this, you will not find it. We are creating it. And the rest of the world believes that. And we have to back it up. It's simple. Let's work together. That's what people want to see. We're not going to solve all the problems. If we had the answers to the problem, I'd be president. You be president.
That's right.
We're not going to change the world. But what we can do is start changing here and invite others to learn from us. That's it.
All right, Marlo, we're going to be looking forward to all the work that you're going to be doing with the Detroit Historical Society and the Detroit 1967 project. We are going to be looking very much forward to that. And more thanks from DPTV. Haig Oshigan from New Michigan Media, thank you very much as well. David Zeman, Bridge Magazine, it's always a pleasure. Lester Graham, you can hear him on Michigan Radio. And Michelle Servinovich from WDET. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for your attention. Again, look for a lot of our work from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and the Detroit Historical Society to be coming out in the next couple of months. We are going to keep you posted, and we appreciate all of the time and attention and investment that you put back into us. Thanks very much. Have a great morning. We do invite you, if you'd like to, stay around the museum for the rest of the morning. We are going to be taping our show My Week here with Stephen Henderson from the Free Press, Nolan Finley from the Detroit News, and myself will do our show here live in the next half hour or so. And then also American Black Journal is going to be taped here as well. So if you'd like to hang around, we'd love to have you. Have a great morning. Take care.